The sun was setting over Oakwood Heights, a quiet, upscale neighborhood in the heart of a small southern town. The evening sky blushed pink and gold, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns and pristine sidewalks. It was the kind of neighborhood where the American dream still felt alive, where families moved to escape the noise of the city and find peace in the simplicity of small-town life. Marcus Green had hoped to find that peace too. Jogging at a steady pace, Marcus breathed in the cool evening air, feeling the tension of the day slowly melt away with each stride. His long legs propelled him down the tree-lined streets, his footsteps steady against the pavement. As he rounded a corner, the sight of a large oak tree standing tall in front of a house caught his eye. The tree's branches stretched wide, swaying gently in the breeze, and for a moment he smiled to himself. It was a reminder of his childhood. Those trees had always meant something special to him. Marcus, the town's newly appointed sheriff, had only recently moved into Oakwood Heights. He wasn't expecting a warm welcome. He knew what people saw when they looked at him. A tall, muscular black man, new to a predominantly white town. He could feel the eyes of the residents on him sometimes, their silent judgments simmering beneath polite greetings and half-smiles. Tonight, however, the street seemed empty. The usual joggers, dog walkers, and kids playing outside had retreated indoors for dinner. That's why Marcus loved this time of day. It gave him space to think, to clear his mind after long hours spent dealing with the chaos of being a sheriff in a town that hadn't yet fully accepted him. But even in the quiet of Oakwood Heights, there was always someone watching. Karen Price, a longtime resident and self-proclaimed community protector, sat on her front porch sipping iced tea. Her blonde hair was styled perfectly, her outfit crisp and coordinated as though she were expecting company. She prided herself on knowing every person in the neighborhood who lived where, who visited whom, and who didn't belong. To her, Marcus didn't belong. From the moment she spotted him jogging past her house, Karen's eyes narrowed. She watched as his lean frame moved down the sidewalk, his movements powerful yet controlled. A frown formed on her face. She hadn't seen this man before. He wasn't one of the regulars in her safe community, and that made her uneasy. "Who is this guy?" Karen muttered to herself, setting her glass down and reaching for her phone. She had her contacts list memorized, and within seconds she was dialing the non-emergency police line. 911. What's your emergency? Karen hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should escalate things. After all, maybe he was just passing through, but a dark thought crossed her mind. What if he wasn't? "There's a suspicious man jogging in my neighborhood," she said, her voice calm but firm. "He's tall, black, and I've never seen him before. He doesn't belong here." The operator asked for more details, but Karen was already convinced. She gave Marcus's description, describing him as though he were a threat rather than just another resident out for an evening run. After hanging up, she sat back on her porch, her heartbeat quickening as she watched Marcus disappear around the corner. The thought of someone like him, someone she didn't know, running through her neighborhood without any explanation, it gnawed at her. Minutes later, a police cruiser rolled down the street, its lights off but its presence unmistakable. Karen's lips curled into a satisfied smirk. She was doing the right thing, wasn't she? Protecting her community from potential danger. In her mind, she was a hero. But deep down, she didn't realize that her fear was rooted in something far more insidious than she was willing to admit. Marcus, unaware of the call that had just been made, continued his jog, feeling the familiar burn in his muscles as he pushed himself further. The rhythmic sound of his sneakers hitting the pavement was soothing, a way to escape the day-to-day stresses that came with being the sheriff of a town he was still getting to know. As he approached the park, his mind began to wander. He thought about his responsibilities, about the changes he hoped to make as the town's first black sheriff. He had grown up in a similar small town, so he understood the unspoken rules, the glances that carried silent judgments. He was used to it, but that didn't mean it didn't sting. Marcus slowed to a stop near a water fountain and took a moment to stretch. His breath was steady, and he looked around, enjoying the stillness of the evening. He loved the town, despite its flaws. There was potential here, potential for growth, for healing old wounds. He had taken the job because he believed in community, in the power of coming together to make things better. But not everyone shared his vision. As Marcus started jogging again, he noticed a police car pulling up slowly behind him. His heart sank slightly, knowing exactly what this was. He had been in these situations before, too many times to count. The officers stepped out of the cruiser, one of them placing a hand on his belt as he approached Marcus. Their body language was cautious, but there was no mistaking the tension. "Excuse me, sir," the officer said, his tone professional but carrying an edge of suspicion. "We received a call about a suspicious person in the area. Can we see some identification?" Marcus stopped in his tracks, taking a deep breath before turning to face the officers. This was the moment. The moment where he could let his frustration boil over or handle the situation with the same calm professionalism that had earned him the title of sheriff. With a small nod, Marcus reached into his pocket slowly, producing his sheriff's badge. The officer's expression shifted from suspicion to shock as they realized who they were talking to. "I'm Marcus Green," he said, his voice steady. "I'm the new sheriff." The silence that followed Marcus's introduction hung heavy in the air. The two officers, both of whom had only been in town a few months themselves, stood there awkwardly, trying to process what had just happened. They had just questioned their new sheriff, a man whose name had only recently begun circulating through the department. The taller officer, Officer Jackson, shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly embarrassed. His partner, Officer Miller, was the first to break the silence. I'm sorry, Sheriff Green, Officer Miller stammered, his face reddening as he glanced at the badge Marcus held out. We didn't recognize you. We were just responding to a call about a suspicious person. Marcus gave a small nod, his expression calm, though the disappointment in his eyes was unmistakable. He had seen this too many times before, the knee-jerk reaction that came when a black man was perceived as out of place even here. In the town where he had been hired to protect and serve, he couldn't escape the shadow of suspicion. I understand, Marcus said, keeping his tone measured. You're just doing your job. But you should be aware that I live in this neighborhood now. I'm not just the sheriff, I'm a resident. Officer Jackson cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. We didn't know that, Sheriff. We'll make sure to inform the rest of the department. Before Marcus could respond, a figure emerged from the darkness behind the officers. Karen had been watching the exchange from a distance, her curiosity and self-righteousness peaking as soon as she saw the patrol car stop in front of Marcus. Her heart had quickened with anticipation, waiting for the dangerous situation to unfold. But as she approached, the realization that something was off began to settle in. Is everything okay here, officers? Karen asked, her voice carrying a haughty air of authority. Her hands were planted firmly on her hips, and her gaze flickered between Marcus and the two officers, clearly expecting a confirmation that her instincts had been correct. Officer Miller shot her a quick, uneasy glance. Yes, ma'am. Everything's fine. Just a misunderstanding. Karen frowned, unsatisfied with his answer. Her eyes settled on Marcus, taking in his calm demeanor, the way he stood there so composed. She was baffled by the lack of escalation. Why hadn't they arrested him yet? Why wasn't there more drama? This man was running through the neighborhood, she pressed, her voice growing sharper. I called you because I didn't recognize him. He looked suspicious. Marcus could feel the weight of her words, the unspoken accusations laced with prejudice. He had encountered women like Karen before, the self-appointed neighborhood protectors, who believed they were acting in the community's best interests, all while masking their fear and ignorance behind a veneer of concern. He turned to face her directly, his gaze steady but not hostile. Mom, my name is Marcus Green. I'm the town's new sheriff. I moved into this neighborhood just last week. Karen's eyes widened in disbelief. Her mouth opened, but no words came out for a moment. It was as if her entire narrative had been shattered in an instant, the reality of the situation crashing down on her like a tidal wave. She looked from Marcus to the officers, searching for some confirmation that this was all a mistake, that she hadn't just called the police on the town's sheriff. But I didn't know, she finally managed to stammer, her confidence faltering. I just thought. You thought I didn't belong here, Marcus finished for her, his voice calm but firm. That's the problem. You didn't know me, so you assumed I was a threat. Karen's face flushed with embarrassment, her earlier bravado melting away. She glanced at the officers, hoping for some kind of support, but they were silent, clearly uncomfortable with the entire situation. I didn't mean anything by it, Karen mumbled, her voice barely audible. I was just trying to look out for the neighborhood. Marcus sighed softly. He wasn't interested in making a spectacle of the situation, but he also knew that this moment had to mean something. It wasn't just about him, it was about the assumptions that people like Karen made every day, assumptions that could easily spiral into dangerous situations for men like him. I understand that you care about your community, Marcus said, keeping his tone measured. But next time, maybe take a moment to ask questions before you jump to conclusions. I'm here to protect this town, just like you want, but I can't do that if people keep seeing me as a threat. Karen looked down, her face red with a mixture of shame and discomfort. She had no response. The reality of what she had done was sinking in, and for the first time she felt the weight of her own bias. Officer Jackson, sensing that the conversation was coming to an end, cleared his throat awkwardly. Sheriff, we'll make sure this doesn't happen again. And, Mom, I think it's best if we all head home for the night. Karen nodded mutely, too embarrassed to speak, and quickly turned on her heel, heading back to her house. The officers exchanged a final glance with Marcus before climbing back into their cruiser and driving away, leaving Marcus alone in the quiet street once more. He stood there for a moment, the cool evening breeze brushing against his skin as he watched the patrol car disappear around the corner. His jaw clenched slightly, the familiar frustration of being judged and misunderstood simmering beneath his calm exterior. As Marcus resumed his jog, his thoughts weighed heavy. He had expected challenges in his new role. He knew that being the first black sheriff in a town like this wouldn't come without its struggles. But it still stung. The reminder that even here, in the place where he had chosen to make his home, he was still seen as an outsider. The sun had nearly disappeared by the time Marcus returned to his house. He slowed to a walk as he approached his driveway, his breathing steady but his mind racing. The incident with Karen had been a small taste of what he was sure to face in the future, but it had also solidified his resolve. He was here to do more than just enforce the law. He was here to change the way this town saw people like him. The next morning dawned bright and clear, casting a warm glow over Oakwood Heights. The air was crisp, and the streets buzzed with the usual weekend activity. Families preparing for the day, children playing in the yards, and neighbors exchanging pleasantries over white picket fences. Inside the sheriff's office, Marcus Green sat at his desk, a steaming cup of coffee beside him. The events of the previous evening weighed heavily on his mind, but he had long learned to keep his emotions in check. His role in this town wasn't just to enforce the law, it was to shift perceptions, to show people like Karen that he was more than what they assumed him to be. Still, the memory of her accusatory eyes and the officer's suspicion clung to him like a shadow. His phone buzzed on the desk, jolting him from his thoughts. It was a message from Deputy Reynolds, a young officer who had been with the force for a few years and had a growing respect for Marcus. The message was short but significant. "Sheriff, we need you at the community center. There's been a report of escalating tensions with some residents. I thought you should handle this one personally." Marcus sighed, grabbed his hat, and stood up. It seemed like trouble never took a day off in this town. As he headed out of the office, his thoughts briefly returned to Karen. He hadn't seen her since the night before, but something told him this wouldn't be their last encounter. The drive to the community center was short, the familiar streets passing by in a blur of small businesses and local charm. The town of Maplewood might have seemed idyllic to outsiders, but underneath its quaint exterior lay deep-seated issues that Marcus was determined to address. The role of sheriff had never been more than just enforcing the law. It was about earning trust and showing people that their assumptions didn't define reality. When he arrived at the community center, a small crowd had already gathered outside. Neighbors were murmuring to one another, their faces drawn with concern. In the middle of the group, Marcus spotted Karen, her arms crossed over her chest as she spoke in hushed but animated tones with a few other residents. His stomach tightened, knowing that whatever was going on, Karen was likely at the center of it. As Marcus approached, the murmurs grew quieter, and the crowd's attention turned toward him. He straightened his shoulders, projecting the calm authority that came so naturally to him as a leader. He scanned the crowd, catching bits and pieces of the conversation, concerns about safety, whispers about unfamiliar faces, and subtle allusions to the previous night's incident. Karen spotted Marcus, and her expression shifted first to surprise, and then to something that resembled guilt. It was clear she hadn't expected him to show up, but now that he was here, she was trapped in the spotlight of her own making. "Sheriff," Karen began, her voice tight, "we were just discussing some issues that have come up in the neighborhood. I think it's important that you're aware of what's happening." Marcus nodded, his eyes steady as they locked with hers. "That's what I'm here for. Why don't you tell me what's going on?" Karen hesitated, glancing around at the gathered crowd for support before continuing. "There's been a lot of unusual activity in the neighborhood lately," she said, her tone carefully measured. "Strange people coming through, unfamiliar faces. I've had a few neighbors express concern about the safety of our community." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Unfamiliar faces?" he asked. "What exactly do you mean by that, Karen?" The tension in the air was palpable. Karen fidgeted with her hands, clearly struggling to frame her words without sounding overtly prejudiced. "Well, you know, people we don't normally see around here. I'm just saying it's making some of the residents uncomfortable." Marcus remained calm, but there was a steeliness in his voice when he responded. "Karen, we've talked about this before. Being unfamiliar isn't a crime. People have the right to walk, jog, and live in this community, regardless of how well you know them. This is a public space, and I expect everyone to be treated with respect." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, sensing the underlying tension between Karen and Marcus. It wasn't just about the jogger from the previous night anymore, it was about something much deeper. Karen wasn't used to being challenged, especially by someone in authority, but Marcus wasn't going to let her off the hook easily. "I understand that," Sheriff Karen said, her voice a little sharper now, "but we still have a right to protect our homes. We've seen a rise in crime in the neighboring town, and people are just trying to stay safe." "I get that," Marcus replied, his tone softening just slightly. "But let's not confuse safety with suspicion. Calling the police on someone just because they look different or aren't familiar to you isn't protecting the community, it's feeding into fear. And fear doesn't keep anyone safe." Karen opened her mouth to respond, but she quickly realized that she had no real defense. Marcus's words had hit home, and the crowd seemed to be on his side, nodding slightly in agreement. She pressed her lips together, clearly uncomfortable with the way the situation was unfolding. Marcus took a step closer to Karen, his voice lowering so that only she could hear. "Last night could have gone a lot differently, Karen. You made a call based on fear, not facts. I'm not here to embarrass you or make you feel bad, but we need to have an honest conversation about how we treat people in this town." Marcus paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words sink in before continuing. He kept his gaze steady, not breaking eye contact with Karen, whose face was now flushed, not from anger, but from discomfort. "I've seen too many situations escalate because of assumptions like the ones you made last night," Marcus said softly. "You didn't know me. and that was enough to make you feel threatened. But you didn't stop to ask who I was or why I was there. Instead, you called the police. And you're not the only one who's done that. It happens all the time. People jump to conclusions because someone doesn't look like they belong, but Karen, everyone belongs somewhere. The silence that followed was thick with tension. The crowd, once murmuring and restless, had grown quiet. Everyone was listening intently now, and the gravity of Marcus's words seemed to hang in the air, undeniable and heavy. Karen looked down at the ground, her bravado from earlier completely gone. Her neighbors, the very people she often felt she was protecting, were now watching her in a different light. It wasn't just Marcus's words that were affecting her. It was the realization that her actions had painted her in a way she hadn't fully grasped until now. Marcus sighed quietly and took a step back, addressing the entire group now. Look, I understand the importance of feeling safe in your neighborhood. I moved here because I believe in this community. But safety isn't just about keeping out the people who don't look like us or who we don't recognize. Safety comes from building trust, from being willing to step out of our comfort zones and get to know each other. There was a quiet murmur of agreement from the crowd. A few people nodded. Some exchanged glances with their neighbors, as if realizing for the first time how easily fear could drive them to make unfair assumptions. I want this town to be a place where everyone feels welcome, Marcus continued, his voice rising just enough for everyone to hear clearly. That means all of us need to work on being a little less afraid of people who seem different. The reality is, you're going to see new faces. This town is growing, and people from different backgrounds are moving in. We need to meet them with open arms, not suspicion. He looked around at the group, making sure to catch the eyes of as many people as possible. As your sheriff, I'm not here to just enforce the law. I'm here to help build a community where everyone feels like they belong. And that means we all have a responsibility to check our own biases, myself included. It's not an easy conversation, but it's one we need to have if we want to keep this place safe for everyone. Karen, still standing near the front of the crowd, shifted uncomfortably. She glanced up at Marcus, her expression softening, her shoulders slumping just slightly. For a moment, she opened her mouth to say something, but the words didn't come. Instead, she just nodded slowly, as if acknowledging that something had changed in her. A few other residents began to speak up. You're right, Sheriff, an older man said from the back of the crowd. We've been too quick to judge. It's time we get to know the people around us better. Another woman, standing next to Karen, chimed in. We've got to stop thinking the worst of people just because they don't look like us. I've been guilty of that too. The atmosphere shifted. What had started as a tense confrontation was slowly transforming into a moment of reflection. Marcus could see the gears turning in people's minds, their expressions softening as they grappled with the reality of their own biases. Karen, feeling the eyes of the crowd on her, finally spoke. Her voice was quieter now, more measured. I didn't mean to cause trouble, she said, her eyes flicking up to meet Marcus's. I didn't think. I see now that I acted out of fear. I'm sorry. Marcus gave her a small nod, his expression kind. We all make mistakes. What matters is that we learn from them. Karen exhaled, some of the tension in her posture easing. She seemed smaller now, not in stature but in presence, as though the burden of her mistake had weighed her down. It was a moment of quiet humility, and while the apology wouldn't erase what had happened, it was a step toward growth for her and for the community. Marcus took a deep breath and addressed the crowd one last time. Thank you all for listening. Let's move forward together and make this town the place we know it can be, a place where everyone feels safe, not just some of us. With that, the crowd began to disperse, people talking in low voices as they walked away. Marcus could hear snippets of conversation, some people reflecting on the discussion, others offering words of support. Karen lingered for a moment longer, looking as though she had more to say but wasn't quite ready. Marcus gave her a brief, understanding smile before turning to walk back to his car. He knew this wouldn't be the last time he faced a situation like this, but he felt a small sense of accomplishment. One conversation wasn't enough to change everything, but it was a start. As Marcus drove away from the community center, he couldn't help but feel the weight of his responsibilities pressing down on him. Being the first black sheriff in this town wasn't just about maintaining order. It was about breaking down barriers and challenging deeply rooted biases that had been allowed to fester for far too long. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but Marcus was ready. He had to be. Not just for himself, but for everyone in this town who deserved a better, more understanding community. Marcus sat behind his desk, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the sheriff's office. He'd been going over the events of the morning, playing the conversations back in his head. As much as he appreciated Karen's apology and the seemingly reflective mood of the crowd, he knew that deep-rooted change wouldn't happen overnight. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Deputy Reynolds, his most reliable officer, standing there with a folder in hand. "Sheriff, got a minute?" Reynolds asked. "Of course, come in," Marcus replied, leaning back in his chair. He gestured for Reynolds to sit down. Reynolds dropped the folder on the desk. "I think we've got a situation brewing that you'll want to handle yourself. It's about the tension you talked about at the community center. Some of the residents are worried, and there's been more chatter about crime spreading from the neighboring town. Marcus opened the folder and quickly scanned the reports. There had been a few burglaries in a nearby area, but nothing out of the ordinary, certainly nothing to warrant the level of fear that had been circulating in Oakwood Heights. "I see what you mean," Marcus said, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "This is about more than just a couple of break-ins. It's fear spreading, feeding on itself. We need to address it before it spirals out of control." Reynolds nodded in agreement. Some of the neighborhood watch groups have been getting more vigilant. Keeping an eye on people they think don't belong. Marcus sighed. "Yeah, that's exactly what I'm worried about. We've got to stop this from turning into a situation where innocent people get caught up in their paranoia." Reynolds leaned forward, his voice lowered. "There's something else. I didn't want to bring this up earlier, but I think you need to know. I overheard Karen talking to some of the other residents after you left the community center. She was apologetic, but some of the others weren't. There's still a lot of resistance to the changes you're trying to bring." Marcus wasn't surprised. He had expected resistance from certain corners of the town, especially from those who were used to their old ways and didn't want to confront their biases. "I figured," Marcus said, his voice calm but resolute. "Change is hard for people, especially when it challenges the way they've been thinking for years. But that's exactly why we need to stay on top of this. If we let fear and prejudice dictate how we respond, this town's going to end up divided, and that's the last thing we need." Reynolds nodded, clearly on the same page. "So, what's the plan, Sheriff?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, his mind already working through the possibilities. "First, we need to engage the community more directly, not just in those town hall meetings, but on a one-on-one level. If people can get to know their neighbors, the people they're afraid of, they'll start to realize they're just like them." Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "You really think that'll work?" "I mean, it's a good idea, but some of these folks are pretty set in their ways." Marcus nodded, acknowledging the challenge. "It's not going to work on everyone, I know that, but if we can reach a few people, if we can get them to see things differently, then maybe it'll spread. We've got to at least try." Reynolds tapped the folder on the desk. "What about this? These crimes in the neighboring town, should we be doing more to address that too?" "We will," Marcus said. "But we need to be careful not to feed into the fear. We'll increase patrols in certain areas, but we're not going to do it in a way that makes people feel like they're under siege. If we start acting like there's a major threat when there isn't, it'll just fuel the paranoia." Reynolds stood up, clearly energized by the conversation. "I'll start working on it. We'll reach out to the community, make sure people know we're on top of things without making them more anxious." Marcus smiled, grateful for the support. "Thanks, Reynolds. I appreciate it." Reynolds nodded and turned to leave, but before he reached the door, he paused. "By the way, Sheriff, I think you handled that situation with Karen pretty well. It could have gone a lot worse." Marcus's smile faded slightly, his thoughts returning to the previous night. "Yeah, it could have," he said quietly. "But that's exactly why we have to keep pushing forward. One wrong move, and it all comes crashing down." After Reynolds left, Marcus sat for a few moments, reflecting on his next steps. He knew that simply talking to people wasn't going to be enough. There had to be action, visible, tangible efforts that showed the community they were all in this together, regardless of where they came from or what they looked like. As he gathered his thoughts, Marcus's phone buzzed again. This time, it was an email notification from the town council. They were requesting his presence at an upcoming meeting to discuss community policing strategies and ways to address the growing concerns about safety. He sighed. The meeting was going to be important, but he knew it would also be a battleground for competing ideas about what safety and security really meant in this town. He would be facing not just practical concerns about crime, but the underlying racial and social tensions that were driving so much of the fear. Marcus closed his eyes for a brief moment, steadying himself. He had faced challenges like this before, in other towns and other departments, but this one felt more personal. Oakwood Heights wasn't just his place of work now, it was his home. He couldn't afford to let it turn into a place where fear ruled over common sense, where people were judged by their skin color or background rather than their actions. The thought of Karen standing there in front of the community center with her assumptions and prejudices on full display gnawed at him. She wasn't a bad person, he knew that much, but her fear and the fear of so many others like her had the potential to do real harm. Marcus stood up, stretching his arms and grabbing his jacket from the back of his chair. There was a long road ahead, but he was determined to take the town in a new direction, a direction where understanding and empathy could outweigh suspicion and fear. It wouldn't be easy, but Marcus wasn't one to back down from a challenge. As he stepped out of his office and into the bright afternoon sun, Marcus resolved to start reaching out to more people in the community, one conversation at a time if necessary. Change might be slow, but it was possible, and he was ready to lead the way. A few days after the incident at the community center, the town council meeting was held in a modest building near the center of town. The air outside had turned cooler, signaling the arrival of fall, and a steady breeze rustled the leaves on the trees lining the street. Inside, the mood was anything but calm. Marcus stood near the back of the room, observing the crowd as people filed in. The turnout was larger than expected, a sign that the tension in Oakwood Heights had reached a boiling point. People were anxious, worried about the changes happening in their town, and he knew that some of the concerns stemmed from Karen's actions and the ripples they had created. The town council sat at the front of the room, a group of 5 individuals, each wearing the strained expressions of people caught between maintaining order and managing the rising fears of their constituents. Councilwoman Linda Matthews, a longtime supporter of Marcus's appointment as sheriff, caught his eye and gave him a small nod. She knew he had his work cut out for him tonight. As Marcus made his way to the front, he could hear the hum of whispered conversations around him. Some were talking about the recent break-ins in the neighboring town, while others were still fixated on the idea that Oakwood Heights wasn't safe anymore. It was the same old narrative, one that Marcus had grown all too familiar with: fear of the unknown, fear of change, and ultimately fear of people who didn't look like them. Councilman Doug Grayson, an older man with deep ties to the town's history, tapped the microphone to get everyone's attention. His stern face betrayed the fact that he wasn't entirely sold on Marcus's progressive ideas. He cleared his throat and began the meeting. "Thank you all for coming," Grayson started, his voice steady but firm. "We've got a lot to discuss tonight, and it's clear that there are some concerns we need to address about the safety of our community. I'd like to open the floor to Sheriff Green, who will be presenting his approach to keeping Oakwood Heights safe." Marcus stepped forward, his face calm but resolute. As he stood at the podium, he could feel the weight of every gaze in the room. He knew that some of the people sitting there didn't trust him. He also knew that tonight was about more than just presenting a plan. It was about shifting the entire conversation around what it meant to be safe in a community like this. "Thank you, Councilman Grayson," Marcus began, his deep voice carrying easily across the room. "I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all tonight." He paused for a moment, scanning the room before continuing. "I know there's been a lot of concern lately. We've had reports of break-ins in a neighboring town, and I understand that people are worried. You want to feel safe in your homes, and that's a natural response. But what we need to talk about tonight isn't just about those crimes. It's about how we, as a community, choose to respond to fear." Marcus could see the shift in the crowd as some people leaned in, listening more intently. Others folded their arms, their skepticism palpable. "I've spent my career in law enforcement," Marcus continued, "and I've seen time and again how fear can drive communities apart. I've also seen how it can be used as a tool to bring people together, to build trust, to build understanding, and to create a safer environment for everyone." He took a breath, knowing that this next part was crucial. "What happened the other night," Marcus said, his voice steady, "was a perfect example of how fear can lead us to make decisions that aren't based on facts. When I was out jogging in my own neighborhood, a call was made to the police because someone didn't recognize me. That call could have escalated into something much worse, but thankfully, it didn't." He saw Karen sitting near the middle of the room, her face unreadable but her eyes fixed on him. She hadn't spoken to him since the community center meeting, but she was here now, listening, and that was what mattered. Marcus continued. "We need to ask ourselves why we're so quick to make assumptions about people we don't know. Why do we let fear dictate our actions, especially when we have an opportunity to get to know our neighbors, to build trust with each other?" A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. Marcus could see some heads nodding in agreement, while others remained stiff, their arms crossed tightly across their chests. "I'm not here to downplay anyone's concerns," Marcus said, his tone firm but compassionate. "I know there's been crime in nearby areas, and we're working on addressing that. But what I won't do is allow this town to turn into a place where we treat people like they don't belong just because they look different or because we don't know them." Linda Matthews spoke up from her seat on the council. "Sheriff Green is right. If we allow fear to divide us, we lose the very sense of community that makes Oakwood Heights what it is." Councilman Grayson shifted uncomfortably, but remained silent, clearly unsure how to respond. Karen, who had remained silent up until now, suddenly stood up. The room grew quiet as she cleared her throat, all eyes turning toward her. Marcus felt the air shift again, knowing that whatever she said next could either push the town forward or drag it back into its old patterns. I want to say something," Karen began, her voice wavering slightly. "The other night, when I called the police on Marcus, I wasn't thinking clearly. I acted out of fear, and I realize now that it was wrong. I assumed the worst without knowing anything about him, and that's not who I want to be." Her voice gained a little strength as she continued. "I don't want this town to become a place where we're suspicious of each other all the time. We're better than that. And I'm sorry, Sheriff, for what I did." The room was silent for a moment, the tension thick in the air. Marcus, standing at the front, gave Karen a small nod of acknowledgement. It wasn't about humiliating her or anyone else, it was about finding a path forward. "Thank you," Karen, Marcus said, his voice sincere. "It takes courage to admit when we've made a mistake, and that's exactly the kind of openness and honesty we need to have in this town if we're going to grow together." There was a soft ripple of applause from the crowd, the first sign that some of the walls dividing them were beginning to crack. Marcus knew this was just the beginning. There would be more challenges ahead, more moments where fear and prejudice tried to rear their heads. But tonight, for the first time, he felt a shift. The town was listening. The walls were coming down brick by brick. And with that, Oakwood Heights had taken its first real step toward becoming the kind of community Marcus had always believed it could be. The meeting wrapped up with a sense of tentative optimism in the room. While not everyone had come around, there were enough nods of agreement, enough shared glances of understanding, that Marcus knew something had shifted. It wouldn't be an overnight transformation, but small changes often marked the beginning of larger movements. As the crowd began to disperse, Marcus made his way toward the door, shaking hands with a few residents on the way out. Councilwoman Linda Matthews approached him with a warm smile. "You did well in there, Sheriff," she said, her voice carrying the weight of genuine respect. "Not an easy thing to change people's hearts and minds, but you're doing it." Marcus smiled back, though his mind was still processing the night's events. "It's a start," he said. "But there's still a long way to go." Linda nodded. "I know, but I've lived here long enough to see when something's shifting. People are starting to listen. That's more than I can say for a lot of places." As Linda walked away, Marcus spotted Karen lingering by the doorway. She had her purse in one hand and looked as though she was debating whether or not to approach him. Her hesitation was clear. She was still grappling with what had happened. Marcus, seeing the uncertainty in her eyes, walked over to her. He didn't want her to leave without knowing that there was a path forward, that this was an opportunity for both of them to grow beyond the moment that had brought them here. "Karen," Marcus said, his tone gentle but firm, "I appreciate what you said back there. That wasn't easy." She nodded slowly, her eyes flicking up to meet his. "I meant it," she said softly. "I really did. I've been thinking a lot since that night, and I realize how much I let my fear get the better of me. I don't want to be that person. I want to be better." Marcus could see the sincerity in her words. For all her initial resistance and bias, Karen was someone who genuinely cared about her community. Even if that care had been misguided at times, she was trying to learn, trying to understand, and that was more than he could say for many people he had encountered over the years. "I know you do," Marcus replied. "And you can be. It's about recognizing when we've made a mistake and learning from it. That's all we can do. Keep moving forward." Karen exhaled a long breath, as though she had been holding on to more than just her words. "I'll try. And I'll talk to some of the others too. Some of them. They're still stuck, but maybe if they see that I'm trying to change, they will too." Marcus smiled softly. "That's all we can ask for." With a final nod, Karen turned to leave, her steps lighter than they had been when she entered. Marcus watched her go, feeling a quiet sense of hope settle in his chest. She wasn't perfect, but she was making an effort. And in a town like Oakwood Heights, that effort meant everything. As the evening air cooled and the town slowly returned to its usual rhythm, Marcus headed back to the sheriff's office. He had a lot of work to do, not just as the town's sheriff, but as someone determined to bridge the gaps that fear and prejudice had created over time. The town's transformation would take time, and there would undoubtedly be setbacks along the way. But after tonight, he knew that the seeds of change had been planted. A few days later, Marcus made good on his promise to engage more with the community. He started meeting with residents in smaller settings, organizing neighborhood gatherings where people could talk openly about their concerns and share their stories. He made it a point to be visible, not just as an authority figure, but as a neighbor, someone who was just as invested in the well-being of the town as everyone else. One afternoon, during a casual neighborhood gathering in the park, Marcus found himself talking with a group of residents about how they could improve safety in ways that didn't rely on fear or suspicion. He listened as people shared their concerns and ideas, but he also made sure to guide the conversation toward building trust and understanding. "Safety isn't just about locking people out," Marcus said, addressing the small group gathered around him. "It's about knowing your neighbors, looking out for one another, and being part of the same community." A few heads nodded in agreement, and Marcus could see that people were starting to shift their thinking. It wasn't about ignoring the reality of crime or danger, but about responding to those challenges in a way that didn't alienate or divide the community. Karen, who had been sitting quietly at the edge of the group, suddenly spoke up. "I think we need more of these," she said, gesturing to the gathering. "More chances for people to actually talk to each other instead of just making assumptions. I know I've learned a lot already." There were murmurs of agreement from the group, and Marcus couldn't help but smile. Karen had gone from being someone driven by fear and suspicion to someone who was now advocating for more understanding. It was a small victory, but it was meaningful. As the sun began to set on the park, Marcus looked around at the faces of his neighbors, feeling a sense of accomplishment. This was why he had taken the job, not just to enforce the law, but to build something stronger, a community where people weren't afraid to learn from one another, where trust could flourish even in the face of past mistakes. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about being willing to change. That evening, as Marcus walked back to his house, he felt lighter. The journey was far from over, but for the first time since he had moved to Oakwood Heights, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. Months later, the town of Oakwood Heights had changed. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of tension, but the atmosphere was different. The town's residents had started to embrace the idea of community in a way they hadn't before. Marcus's leadership, combined with the willingness of people like Karen to confront their own biases, had paved the way for a new chapter in the town's story. Neighborhood gatherings became more frequent, And slowly, the barriers between people began to break down. Marcus's presence in the town was no longer a point of curiosity or suspicion. It was a symbol of the progress the community was making together. For Marcus, this was just the beginning. He knew that the work of building trust, dismantling prejudice, and fostering understanding was ongoing. But Oakwood Heights was on the right path now, and as long as people were willing to learn, to grow, and to change, there was hope for a better future. And for Marcus Green, that was all the reason he needed to keep going.